Where did I miss the mark this year? Who do I need to talk to? How can I make my life and the lives of other people better? And so, we ask these questions with compassion for ourselves and compassion for other people, that we are all human with all of our beauty and challenges and difference, that part of moving forward towards justice. Cornel West says, I just love this very simple quote, that justice is what love looks like in public. And I hold that with me. And with that, I'm going to turn to our lunch plenary session. I'm really excited for this session because I think it's so important. And I think it's really exciting to build on the conversation of this morning and talk about what's happening locally. We often talk in policy circles about underserved communities in general, or communities of color in general, without acknowledging the historical context and needs of different populations, whether it's race, gender, disability, other markers of who we are. And so today we're going to be talking about race, and particularly about the Black community. And even just a quick overview of the oppression of Blacks in Oregon. It's some historical, some continuing to this day, and they all influence lives, all influence Black experience in Oregon today, from Black exclusion from Oregon, the KKK, the Vanport flood, the destruction of neighborhoods in North Portland, and Memorial Coliseum, I-5, Manual Hospital, redlining, subprime lending, Measure 11, policies that lead to gentrification, displacement. That's just a short subsection of the things that is our legacy here in Oregon and the work that we have to do. Nearly half of white people surveyed about Ferguson said the issue of race got too much attention. It got more attention than it deserved. And it made me so sad. Because we need to talk more about eliminating structural and institutional racism, and more about stopping the violence against communities of color, and more about changing the paradigm. So I'll stop talking now and let the panel talk. I think it's going to be more of a conversation than separate presentations, so I'm going to introduce all three of our panelists now. Immediately to my left is Cat Goughnour. She is a human rights activist and advocate for underserved and marginalized communities. She conducts equity and inclusion research and consults with nonprofit and governmental entities. She was raised on the Oregon coast, received her bachelor's degree here at Portland State, and received her master's in sociology from the London School of Economics with a specialization in race, ethnicity, and post-colonial studies. Next to Kat is Lisa Bates, who's an assistant professor at the Toulon School of Urban Studies and Planning here at PSU. Professor Bates does research related to housing policy and planning. Her work is focused on social justice issues, including understanding how inequitable outcomes may arise from institutionalized racism in policy and implementation. And then lastly, we have Stephen Gilliam Jr., who's a U.S. Army veteran and a community activist. He Stephen specializes in public policy as it relates to racial justice, economic development, and systems change. He's been active in many organizations and serves on Portland's Citywide Equity Committee. He's a graduate of Western State Center's Institute for Leadership Development and the African American Lead Capacity of Emerging Leaders. So with that, I will turn it over to Kat to get us started.
Good afternoon, everyone. Oh, thank you. Thank you all for joining us. The case study we're going to speak about is one of the most entrenched and protracted issues in our region. We often frame our future, our collective future in Oregon as having increased diversity going forward. This is very true. And so also, as we're kind of looking to this more multicultural future, how do we address some of the long-standing problems we've had? And so we will be talking about gentrification displacement. We will also be looking towards solutions and partnership opportunities, collaborative opportunities And I will kind of give you the quick and dirty history with a couple of maps, just to serve as a context. But before I start, I just wanted to know by show of hands, how many of you, based on Mara's quick historical overview, kind of know the history of African Americans here in Oregon? Oh, fantastic. That's a very good turnout. I'm sure you all have had the opportunity to see Dr. Walida Imarisha talk about some of those issues and why there are so few Black people in Oregon. And if you haven't, I do recommend a lot of these resources. I think as we go forward, it will be very important to see where we've been to figure out how we can stabilize a community that's had a very interesting history here. So I will not be starting at the inception of Oregon. It's a little too far back for me, and I think a lot of what we're talking about is kind of what happened around World War II, Vanport, and the kind of bringing African Americans for the shipbuilding industry. And as we're talking also about economic justice and deindustrialization, this will also set the context as we talk about economic justice as a critical intervention for stabilizing communities. What's happening? So Okay, so I started out in Oregon as a fair housing advocate, came back in 2012 from England where I was doing my studies, and came across the HOLC maps, the Homeownership Loan Corporation maps, and was also surprised to find that in 1938 they had created one for Oregon. I think at that point in time we had less than 5,000 African Americans in the whole state. However, we still were able to designate areas where lending was not made available to people to buy homes. This also mapped very much onto the restrictive covenants and the location of African Americans, specifically in Alberta, Albina area. So the maps I've chosen will kind of overlay as we move forward. If you don't know kind of the layout of Portland, we will be focusing most specifically on the Alberta, Albina area, which is up on the top portion, the most red part on the top portion. So along with this map came, as Mara said, the creation of the Memorial Coliseum, also the I-5 freeway projects, as well as the extension of Legacy Emmanuel Hospital, all of which had successive impacts on the Black community. Many of the homes were taken through eminent domain for all of these large-scale productions. And so, as we'll see in these next maps, which are being circulated by Portland Housing Bureau, as they're doing community engagement around $20 million that will go towards stabilizing communities, we can see how that caused a concentration of African Americans in a specific area. So I'm not sure if you've seen these maps. If you haven't, they're amazing. There are some community engagement opportunities. Basically from 1970, this was after Legacy Emmanuel, we see, and sorry for the pun, the darker part is where there will be more African Americans located with, it's essentially a heat map, so the lighter areas have less concentrations of diversity. So we can see from the 1970s and 80s that the concentration remains fairly stable. Of course, there is immigration and migration happening through this time, and people tend to kind of start to spread out a little bit more in that Alberta, Albina area. By 1990, things had just started to shift, and you'll see this is the era right before the creation of the Interstate Corridor Urban Renewal Area, also known as ICURA, which is a PDC development initiative in this area. Essentially, because of the concentration of people of color, Black people in this area, there was a lot of disinvestment. There, as we said, there was not a lot of access to credit or anything of that nature. So the creation of ICURA circled all 10 neighborhoods with the highest African American population. There were a lot of city community partnerships that happened in advance of that. Most specifically, the Albina Community Plan, which I just learned the other day was adopted into the 1980 Comprehensive Plan. So as we think about what this next iteration of the Comprehensive Plan should look like, we can also revisit a lot of those recommendations that were put in specifically by community members to stem displacement and to create opportunities for the residents who live there. The focus wasn't so much on the sticks and bricks or the built environment, but really how to make a neighborhood that was beautiful, thriving, and provided a lot of health and wealth opportunities for a population who hadn't historically been able to take advantage of some of those benefits. So by 2000, we can see with the increase of housing prices and property values, and the fact that most African Americans did not hold land in that area, we already see a large outmigration of the population. By 2010, we can see that the population has dropped by almost 50%. Some estimate we've lost up to 20,000 African Americans in that area in the past 10 to 15 years. If we think about the African American population in the whole state of Oregon, and as was said, I'm not from Portland, I'm from Newport, and like I always say, we were the African American family there until we moved up here. It's funny. I lost my train of thought now. Thank you for laughing. Essentially, this removal has been due to perhaps a lack of policy. There have, as I said, been a lot of outcry by the community about our needs. Really, as we're trying to figure out how to go forward, thinking about the displacement of potentially a half of all the African Americans in the entire state, with about 90% of us living up here. Let me see. The other thing I find very interesting is if we look at the redlining map, it's essentially an area that was blighted, right? There were not a lot of opportunities. In 2013, the Portland Housing, this was the overlay map of the interstate corridor or urban renewal area. But by 2013, Portland Housing Bureau released an opportunity map. It's a composite map of multitudes of livability factors. And we can see now that the area that was most disinvested is now the area of highest opportunity. It maps onto the Pearl, Memorial Coliseum, Alberta, Albina. And what we know about most African Americans who have had to move through displacement and gentrification is they are now located in the periphery of this area where you can see it is, again, an area of very low opportunity. And just to take it back to the topic, BPS, Bureau of Planning and Sustainability demographic document shows the economic impact this is having still today on this community. So I'm going to turn it over. We will have a moderated conversation. That was just to be a bit of a quick background, and we will have opportunity to ask questions, and ultimately we are looking for solutions and action items.
Thanks, Kat. That was wonderful. So kind of what Mara was talking about earlier with the Oregon's racist history, and then what Kat has shown with these disparities that we have, is perpetuated by this thing called institutional racism. And that's a buzzword nowadays in our local city government. We actually have acknowledged the existence of institutional racism, and we've tried to counter that with equity initiatives. But I think, one of the hurdles that we're finding is that we don't have a real understanding about what institutional racism is that we can all share and know that will inform kind of the way we attack that problem. So institutional racism is a systemic empowering of white people, namely rich white people that are controlling our economy. And it serves to perpetuate that power at the expense of groups of color, specifically black people, but also other groups of color. In the city government, where we have established an Office of Equity and Inclusion, and they're charged with eliminating institutional racism, coming up with a strategic plan. But we've kind of limited ourselves to dealing with racism on an interpersonal level, or dealing with diversity, and trying to hire more, or keep doing what we're doing, but give a certain amount of money to minority contractors or the like. Now, this is kind of ignoring our racist history. Oregon was set up by a group of wealthy white elites to be a white homeland, and they set up our institutions to primarily function to continue that paradigm. So without looking at our core, functions as a city government, we're not really going to be able to attack it, I would say, effectively and completely. And I think, Kat has a little bit more about, will and what we should be doing.
So I also come to this work as a community health worker. Like Dr. Akam was saying earlier, the reframing of the impacts of racism on people as a health issue, I think, is a very powerful move forward. I really do commend Portland for looking at things in this way. I think it gets us to a lot of different solutions. It also gives us that sense of urgency that was mentioned this morning, right? If we're talking about foreshortened lifespan and the impacts of exclusion, there is a lot of opportunity. Move back to Oregon thinking about the argument from evil, as they say, or what is the thing that keeps us from moving forward? Is it the will? I think we have the will. All of these equity initiatives show we are ready to grapple with these very difficult conversations. So the question then is it about the ability? How do we implement the solutions we want to see? Do we have the capacity? Does our government have the capacity? Do our communities have the capacity? And if not, in any of those places, how do we build coalitions and partnerships to really make real the implementation of these strategies? They're beautiful on paper, but if we still have the same outcomes, our intentionality doesn't matter much. So that's really, a lot of the conversation we're going to have here today, and the questions we put to you for the Q&A, given all of your roles in organizations and different parts of the government, how do you see us working together to tackle some of these entrenched issues?
As we're talking about this, we're talking about sort of equity goals, and how we've set those equity goals, at least in the city of Portland, Metro has set equity goals, and yet the outcomes are still not where they need to be. And I want to hear, you guys have participated in many of these processes, have been engaged in this work, and I'm curious what, with the initiatives that are happening, what isn't working? What's going awry in terms of goals and design and those sorts of things, and how do we flip it?
So I participated quite extensively in both the Portland Plan and the Equity Technical Advisory Group, creating the strategy for racial justice for the city of Portland, also in the creation of Office of Equity and Human Rights, right, working with these public sector agencies. And I think one place that in the implementation where we got caught in this internal versus external false dichotomy, right? So the idea of many of these strategies of the public sector was, we public sector agencies need to get our own house in order and fix our internal business, essentially. And I think that there's been sort of a misunderstanding, and as the implementation goes down the road, that somehow the city or metro city should be turning its focus externally into the community because the internal thing doesn't have enough impact. But the idea was that changing the internal practices, right, actually doing an equity analysis of programs, policies, budgets, implementation, would be to change those practices in a way that affects the community, right? So if you're an infrastructure asset manager, working in transportation or water and sewer or whatever, that you're looking at your triple bottom line metrics, you're figuring out how to add social equity and actually realign investments and resource allocations. Then we externally would feel that because we would see that there was a change in where sidewalks were or where bus lines were running or how our stormwater was being managed. And that would be the impact that we would have, right? And that would trickle up to our health or our well-being, et cetera. And so it was really about fundamentally changing basic city government functions, right? Or Metro's functions or TriMet's functions. And that would be really good, and that would be great. That was also what I would describe as internal changes, which is really distinct, I think, from an idea that we should go out like in the community and do something at the community that's not our usual public sector function, right? So I would say, maybe a very clear-cut example. So we heard for a second this morning about the Ban the Box campaign. So in Ban the Box campaign is to eliminate the sort of single checkbox on forms that says, do you have a felony conviction in your past? So for the city of Portland or Metro or whatever agencies, Washington County, to adopt that would be an internal HR policy, right? So there's probably some big internal process at Human Resources to think about, okay, how do we change that form? How do we do our interviewing? How will we change our practices inside? It would have huge impact, particularly on African American men, right? Who are vastly disproportionately represented in terms of having felony convictions. So that would be an internal systemic change that would have an external impact. Great. What I would describe as a wrong-headed thinking about what the public sector should be doing is something like this Black Male Achievement Initiative, which basically says the city should get engaged in the mentoring of young Black men to address, and I think Dr. Acom this morning had exactly the right sort of dichotomy. It's an achievement gap solution, not an opportunity gap solution. So it sort of says, like, we're going to help you to act right and be more respectable in your self-presentation because something about Black people is culturally dysfunctional, instead of doing what the city actually does as a normal business, which is things like, maybe we should be working on providing a safe way for you to get to school, and then other people who work on mentoring and education will help you, do that, right? So it doesn't really, really doesn't get structures or institutional barriers at all, right? So, I personally, I would be more than happy to hang out with some young Black people and tell them about code switching and how to be a successful person in a higher educational institution. I'm delighted to do that in my personal time, right? But if the city of Portland or the state of Oregon is going to have a certificate program to give someone like a sticky gold star saying you've achieved something, I would prefer for that not to be you've achieved getting your pants up at your waist. I would prefer for that to be a program that is like, hey, landlords who know how to not discriminate against people with Section 8 vouchers, here's a sticky gold star for you, right? Teachers who do not discriminate, here's a sticky gold star for you. And those things would be, about institutional change and not about continually describing us as dysfunctional people who just need to do better in the system that we have.
Yeah, and kind of, interrupting the harm should be one of our major goals, right? Rather than building ancillary programs or refining how we deliver equity, or now we're just doing outreach to everything. So we'll have this whole plan, we'll get the funding for it, we'll get the basic parameters, and then we'll go outreach in 17 different languages to all these communities and then see how they want us to deliver this plan, right? That's not the way to do things. Or we'll put it on the website and we'll make maps, or we'll track disparities. I would like to see us, track how much wealth are we building for the elites in our society, right? I think, fortunately, a fortunate effect of this economic downturn is that middle-class white people are starting to understand that this economy and our traditional ways of doing things isn't built for them either, right? And so we have institutions like the PDC that have always existed, and that's the only way we can provide development. But we're not really coming with the analysis of, hey, maybe redirecting a community pot of money to a few wealthy developers and leveraging that is only continuing the status quo. And maybe if we started tracking, hey, how much money did we make for Bank of America last year by subsidizing their real estate investments? I think we should start tracking that. Maybe we could kind of get a handle on, hey, our basic functions in our government and a huge amount of the money we spend is not only going to deliver these ancillary community benefit services, but is mainly going to pad the pockets of those that are perpetuating these disparities.
And based on what Dr. Aiken is saying, the idea of community-based participatory approaches is really important. And specifically, in talking about power sharing, what does that look like? You know, what Steve is saying, is it just outreaching to a community who hasn't been brought to the table, or is it really allowing people in the community to be the source of their own ideas and solutions, and to provide the leadership and also, you know, that more culturally specific frame or approach that can help government to be a bit more responsive? Also with respect, as Dr. Aiken said as well, he did steal a bit of our thunder, which is fantastic. It's about decision making. You know, what does outreach look like? What do a lot of these solutions look like? Are they harm reduction models? Are they preventative? You know, the thing about public health that is so powerful is really, with all the data we have, we can understand some of the root causes for the issues. So, you know, doing some of the things Dr. Bates spoke about, you know, that people might be a bit self-congratulatory, is very downstream. It actually won't make a significant difference in the community. You know, one of the things specifically around the creation of ICURA was the idea that we needed to do desegregation. Desegregation of African Americans is very interesting thinking when the HUD mandate is also deconcentration of poverty and access to opportunity. So instead of saying, you know, let's put more affordable housing or do inclusionary zoning or something of that nature that would allow African Americans who are specifically bounded in a geography to live like in the Pearl or Skyline or Southeast and really have access to some amazing jobs, we simply said the best thing to do, the cultural dysfunction piece, is to disband people. You know, there's so much research that talks about community as a source of strength that it actually, you know, for all the cliches. But when you rip that apart, it's called root shock, and it causes a traumatic experience in people who experience it. And so the thing is, people are not being allowed to kind of use the social and cultural capital to even stabilize themselves necessarily, and instead are being kind of moved out, and at the same time we're saying we have done integration. You know, we are doing a thing that HUD is mandated. Perhaps there is a more community-friendly way of doing this.
I think this is a space, particularly what Kat is talking about right now, where the disaggregation of communities of color and a real hard look and focus on what Blackness and anti-Black racism do to the way that we develop policy is really important. That there are groups of communities of color who are able to access the notion of a congregation or a cultural community that should be preserved, that should be celebrated. And it's not to say that other communities of color don't also face very serious barriers of racism, because they do. But the opportunity to create a Jade district, which is fantastic. I mean, to have a night market, to celebrate a culture, a set of cultures, the diversity of API communities in a space, right, seems to be supported. That's neat, that's cool, it's something we like and we like to access. And it's really hard to imagine even what people think that would mean for the Black community, right? And so I have heard that reflected back, including from people who work in the public sector, but like, what would that be, MLK as a Black cultural community? Really harder, like what? Is it soul music? What is it, right? Because we get really uncomfortable when we talk about Black culture, because it's like you don't want to be Bill O'Reilly like yelling about hip hop music, but it's like, what is it? How do we activate that? And that's part of that history. That history of anti-Black racism has been to both separate us as a community from our ability to create and build and celebrate our culture, but also to make us seem cultureless to the majority and to the dominant population. And it needs a special understanding of that specific focus to help us to sort of move that forward.
And I think it's really hard for us to move that forward as Black people without the power to do so. Right? We have a largely all-white city leadership with the decision-making power. And, you know, when it comes to racism, and especially anti-Blackness, it's perpetuated by white people being oblivious to it and not really understanding, oh, hey, that's anti-Black, and oh, this is my white privilege acting. It's just a normalized thing for white people. And, you know, without the leadership of communities of color and Black communities, we're not going to be able to really get into the nitty-gritty and the real things that are really going to make structural change and end racism, which would actually benefit everybody. But there's really a lot of structural barriers in place right now, and we need strong Black leadership to be empowered rather than silenced.
I think we're often challenged. I mean, certainly, where are we at? Like in the city of Portland, 6% African American in the metro area, something like 2.5%. And so it's also this response of sort of like, well, but how much representation could you really have? Because percentage-wise, it's not even one person on city council, right? 6%. But you know, I think that's a really problematic way to look at representation and power. We don't add people, we don't add diverse people to a decision-making body until we reach proportionality. We add diverse people who come from a different perspective that's been marginalized or underrepresented or oppressed until we change the structure, right? Until we change the decisions and outcomes that are happening, not until we reach some magic Crayola box that sits there. Because it's really kind of not fair, a little rude actually, to say we've created a geography, a political jurisdiction that has excluded you for a long time. So there's not that many of you, so therefore there can't be that many of you at the seat of power. Right? That's the logic. That's a problem.
And just to kind of nuance a bit institutional racism, there was a report done by the City Club here in Portland in 1967, around the time all the riots were happening around the nation. And if you're not familiar with the Kerner Commission reports, very interesting. They identified all the same issues as causing civil unrest, social, economic, and political disenfranchisement and exclusion. The very interesting thing that was said here was that the non-responsiveness of government was one of the additional barriers identified here in Portland. And so Kamara Jones, who's with the CDC, an amazing public health individual, really also reframes institutional racism. I just really want us to think about it not just as barriers, but also the inaction in the face of suffering. For me, that's really, really profound. And as I said, for me, the public health frame is one of the most important. I've had the pleasure to meet Dr. Lawrence Wallach recently. If you don't know the work he's doing, I think some of you sat in the developmental origins of health and disease. There was a presentation this morning. It's absolutely amazing. I was asking him if we can attribute causality, right? Dr. Aiken was saying the same thing. Is the environment really making us sick? Is it the stressors that we are experiencing to a large degree that actually is having these negative outcomes on our health? And he says to me, at this point, there is enough research to show that to be the case, unless, and Dr. Aiken's experience, his mother's experience of having the allyship of the white person who helped her to purchase her home. Like Steve is saying, we do really need strong Black leadership, but in a city that's 90% white, we also really need people who are willing to be allies and advocates, who really want to work in collaboration with communities of color. The Community of Color Coalition report said a lot of this stuff needs to be led by people of color. We can't do it alone. And so the kind of call to action I have, we've been learning. We've been learning so much over at least the past 5 years about the history, what has or hasn't been done, what has or has not worked. And so if we know today the suffering is as severe as it is, and Multnomah County just put out their disparities report, out of 31 indicators, African Americans are heavily impacted in 28 of those. And they have horrible consequences for maternal child health. What are we willing to do? What do we, now that we know the problem, what do we think are the steps that are necessary to get us there? How can we all start working together? And how can we implement meaningful change, do evaluation and monitoring, and make sure that we are actually achieving the outcomes we want quickly, since there is a sense of urgency.
Sure. Let's do that. All right. Well, you guys, this might work. Well, all right, Scott, if you'll take the microphone. So you guys didn't need moderating at all. There's plenty to say on this. And so I think Kat's last statement really sets the frame for questions and conversation here. How do we, what organizations need to engage? What roles? What can we do differently as we move forward? So I'll open it up to the audience to ask questions and comments.
Can we pick up Multnomah County for an African American focused health initiative?
Right. And funding.
I really appreciated the presentation, and thank you. I'm Joanne Hardesty, and my question is, African Americans seem to have dropped off the radar screen for policymakers, especially within Multnomah County. And so, with all these disparities, with the new report out, I mean, there's no new information. What might be new is that there would be an elected official or a director that actually would take on tackling this issue. As a community member, I'm frustrated that we just seem to have disappeared. Unless we're talking about jail numbers, we don't really talk about the African American experience here in Portland, Oregon. So, I guess that wasn't really a question.
I mean, I would say, one challenge, and I understand it like on a psychological and organizational level, is that it feels better to have a do-over. And so there's issues and sort of newcomer communities or issues popping up in other communities where I think there's this notion of like, we can mitigate and we can prevent, which is easier to do and it's critical to do, and it feels good like we got a do-over. But if we don't get to restitution and reparation, then we're not actually really fixing racial justice. We're just kind of like kicking the can down the road. So I think this legacy racialized history for African Americans is it's really important to focus there. We have to do both things, right? It's both and.
Hi, thanks so much for your talk, first of all. I'm over here.
Okay.
So I was really intrigued by when you brought up like the J district, like what would that look like in an African American neighborhood? And I did a lot of undergraduate work about Portland in the 60s and 70s, and so there was all this movement with like the Office of Economic Opportunity and Black Power groups taking advantage of government opportunities like albino citizens together, but that was totally repressed by like police and media and more established government. So there was like this time in history where it was coming into fruition and then kind of was silenced again. And I'm wondering if any of you had insight in like how to reignite those conversations from that era without like bringing up all like the negative public memory around like, misconceptions of Black power or like people assuming that the war on poverty was failed. Because a lot of those were conversations largely centered around race.
Okay, so Lisa's looking at me crazy because you kind of said, how do we create political will to help Black people without bringing up a negative public memory?
Well, not falling into the trap of the dominant narrative.
Yeah, Lisa said, who set the trap? I think, when you're talking about kind of upsetting the power structure and empowering Black people specifically, people are going to be upset about that, right? The media is not going to paint that in a good light, right? Trader Joe's was about Black people hating Trader Joe's or something, right? The power structure is going to push that on the general public. And what we really need is...
That was attributed to us at the very same moment integration happened. So, Moynihan very much said, you've got these dysfunctional families and really the source of unrest and impoverishment and underdevelopment comes from, almost a biologically deficient model. And so the question I would have is, looking at city policy, why for African Americans would it be that all 10 neighborhoods with the highest concentration would be ringed with an urban renewal area, and that what they're doing now out in East Portland is creating neighborhood prosperity initiatives, which are a very different thing. They're community controlled. They do have a smaller amount of money, but we cannot minimize the importance of an ethnic economic enclave and the fact that people are able to provide goods and services that actually the people around them need and rely on culturally. And, you know, in the public health research, so much of that is also attributed to the protective factors Lisa was speaking about. You know, what they found is people who, firstly, choose to move to the United States, even if they're immigrants or refugees, it is a very different experience for them, their health outcomes, than for people who have been here historically who never had a choice and who've never been fully integrated. So I think the question you bring up is so important, and really the question is, yes, how do we put forward self-determination and autonomy, which is what Black Power advocates and Black Panthers were doing. Now a lot of other communities of color are using those same words, and I'm saying no one is going to want us to lead initiatives because of the way they conceptualize our positioning. They say we're lazy, they say we can't learn. You know, it doesn't take much to look at, really, the narrative that envelops that. So trying to figure out allies. How do we change a narrative? How do we look to the environment we're forced to exist in and say, you know, I think I could thrive if I had access to education, if I had a living wage job. And I'll just say for me, growing up in Newport, and being the only Black family was very difficult. I was a high school dropout. And it wasn't until I moved to Portland, where there were more than one high school, where there were some community colleges and college, that I was able to even know that I could learn. And so, you know, for me to get to the London School of Economics based on that was something I could never conceptualize as a first-generation, non-traditional college student. What other talents are we missing out by not allowing people the access to the very basic things they need to realize their full potential, right? So I think there are many ways we can come at it, but we really have to be honest about some of the factors that are keeping people down. It isn't that we don't want to participate or we've got saggy pants or, you know, we're angry Black people. There are some other things that disempower us.
Hi, my name's Tia Henderson, and I really appreciate the context that you gave and the stories that you're sharing right now, as well as sort of calling all of us in the room to think bigger. And the question I have as a white person, you know, I consistently am finding myself surrounded by other white people who aren't being willing to kind of have some of these conversations. And I'm trying to think, you know, recently, you may recall there was sort of a kerfluffle in the news about how some of our elected leaders had a white man's racial equity training. And, you know, some of the jokes aside from that were out about that, my immediate thought was like, damn straight, we need them to know things. We need them to see things. And if they can't even talk about this, how are we gonna get anywhere as long as they are currently in power until we change power? So as a person who has some power, just being a white person, is the response to that media like holding that up as saying, well, actually that's not a waste of taxpayer dollars, that needs to be a part of this? Or is that a sidestep because we haven't gotten to the point where we have people of color in power? There's sort of no one right way.
Well, so, Tia, the thing that, for me that's difficult to respond to that specific incident of the training that happened, so for City of Portland leaders who were white males to go to diversity training, I don't really know what they did there. So if what they did there, I mean, and there's like a lot of different kinds of diversity and equity training. Personally, I care much more about people workshopping their actual job. What do I do? What decisions do I make? What policies do I implement? What programs do I run? What practices? And how do those embed racism, racist assumptions, classism, gender norms, ableism, and how do I change that? Like, I'm much more interested in that workshop than the workshop where people just understand that white privilege exists. So I don't really know what happened at that workshop. Maybe it was awesome, maybe it wasn't. The other thing I guess I feel about that as a feeling is that some people got to go to a special place and have some conversations, and some of us don't get to go to a special place, and our conversations, which are constant, everyday, and nonstop, and which now I found out in a really dramatic, pictorial way might be like taking years off my life to have, you know, it's like what, so is there an equivalent thing that's also for leaders of color or non-lead line staff of color to be supported in their work and their conversations? I talk about this a lot in my educational sphere here at PSU. Since the time that I got tenure, I don't really care that much about the emotional comfort of white folks in the room. I care about the emotional comfort and safety of folks of color in the room. So that's my
Thank you.
The question I really had, and it's really to Lisa's point, yes, firstly, how are we teaching a common language to white people and folks of color if only white people are receiving this kind of training? Racism is not intuitive. Dealing with racism and having resilience is not intuitive. You know, I think it's very much about processing it and figuring out how you can have those conversations with other people. The other thing I'll say is if I look at that budget allocation, to me that still looks like structural racism. You know, if that's an open RFP process, then how can they at the same time say, we would only want a white person to receive this $56,000 for a 3-day training? That doesn't seem like an open RFP process to me if, you know, there's already someone in mind. And the other thing is, as a person of color, I love having these conversations, and I will always, because I'm from here and I think the need is great. But I would also love to be paid that amount of money every 3 days to engage in these conversations with general society. I would be so rich. So, you know, really, I would do the work all day for that amount of money.
We have time for just one more question.
I don't necessarily a question, but I'd ask you not to underestimate the level of helplessness elected officials can feel when they don't have good people coming to them and saying, here's a specific thing that you can do. Because, you know, some of us come to office with a few specific things we want to do, but we need other people to come to us with specific ideas. I mean, I was delighted, actually, when folks from the Urban League, the AFL-CIO, came to me a few months ago and said, hey, a number of other cities and states have done this thing called ban the box. And I said, wow, that's great, we can do that. And I'm quite confident in the next few months we will do that, not just for the city as an employer, but the city as a whole. And we need more examples like that of concrete things that we can do. I think that Stephen's probably right about the use of urban renewal, but I don't have the tools yet to articulate why we should shut down the use of urban renewal in a way that will convince my colleagues. Because Nick Fish will say, well, without urban renewal, we'd have no money for affordable housing, so you can't shut down urban renewal. So even with goodwill, don't underestimate our feelings, our level of ignorance and our feelings of helplessness. Somebody is steps forward with a specific thing that we can do, I mean, that's the best gift that we can have.
Good to know you're a champion, and that we can come to you with those ideas, because I think a lot of times we're not sure who will actually kind of put their power where their mouth is. So thank you for letting us know you're ready for any kind of suggestions for neighborhood stabilization.
I would echo that thank you, and I will be sending you a list for it. Also, please tell Nick Fish that if he would like to end urban renewal, that money would go into the general fund, and then they could put it for affordable housing. Problem solved.
The problem is the city only gets a fifth of it back.
I think as long as one doesn't stop with the feelings and gets deep into the intellectual guts of it, then we're great. we just gotta move out of the feelings stage pretty rapidly, at least in our professional roles.
And I just have one more question, Mr. Novak. You kind of illustrated so beautifully, the question I have is it will, or the ability, the capacity to make the change happen. And so as community members who are, grappling with these issues but don't have a lot of the access, and often when we get to City Hall, we're not actually that welcome, and things might or might not be said, and then publicly another thing is said. How do we help the city, everybody, firstly comply with their legal obligations to serve all citizens and to be inclusive, and then also how do we help build the capacity for those people to really start thinking strategically and holistically about what a healthy community looks like for us?
That's a big question. I think I'll only try to address the first part of the access part, which is I think that all of us in City Hall probably like to think that we're accessible to everybody. And but the degree to which that true probably varies, is never all that true. But persistence is important. I mean, if somebody asks once and twice and 3 times and 4 times and 5 times, people want us to talk about something, sometimes the 5th time is what works. That's just a fact. Some of us respond to emails more than others. Like, if you email Amanda Fritz, she will personally read the email, and that matters. Another thing is that people don't take advantage of the 3 minutes that 5 people the way they could. We tend to see the same, 20 people that use that space up every week over and over. And I have seen it happen, that somebody comes and uses that 3 minutes in a council session or testifies in front of a random bill that where, just give a random example. When we were doing our legislative agenda last year, maybe it was 2 years ago, somebody came at the last minute and said, hey, why aren't you trying to ban studded tires? And the mayor said, you know what, that's a good idea. We probably haven't taken a run at that in the last 20 years. Let's try it again. So there are these methods, these means of access that not that many people take advantage of. And I think that more people should.
Guys,
Let's hear it.
you want to do it?
Yeah.
All right. All right, one.
Where did that come from?
I don't know where that came from.
What I heard was that was not a really acceptable answer.
Do you guys have any
Well,
thoughts
I
on
would
that
say,
before
I
we
think
go?
that our elected officials need to have a really rigorous self-examination, and will help you in thinking about how quickly and effectively you respond when people do bring things up, because we can all see what issues and what communities and constituencies get immediate responses and which get a sort of, we think about it, study about it, work on it later kinds of responses.
And not to mention when they say, what's the black community? Like, as if we're all monolithic. What's the black community, what does the black community want? As if one person can speak for the whole community.
Justice.
Justice. Guys. And with that, I think it reflects how challenging these conversations are and how much work we have to do. And I don't want to sum it up as if that's like the answer. But we have a lot of work to do. Any final words from you guys before I transition over to the breakout sessions?
Thank you very much.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.